First off, thank you very much, Eduardo, for hosting me, for inviting me here. Thanks for everybody who came. I'm curious, do we have any Venezuelans in the audience? And are there history students, South American poli-sci students? Is that partly who's here? Do we have any J school students here? Journalism students? Great.
Maybe online, yeah.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, a little bit about me. First of all, I started out as a journalist in Mexico in the late 1980s. And I was a stringer for a couple of papers, San Francisco Chronicle and the Fort Worth newspaper. And then I moved to New York and started working at the New York Post as a reporter, and then eventually moved to the Times. And after I was at the Times for a few years, I became the bureau chief for the Times in South America, and I covered the Andes region. So I covered Caracas, and I covered Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and then also Guyana and Suriname and French Guiana. So I got to know the region. I traveled a lot around the region. I got there in 2012, which is a very fortunate time to get there, because before Chavez had come down with cancer, and in 2012 he declares that he's cancer-free, trying for re-election. It was an election year, and the price of oil was over $100 a barrel, so everything was booming, and like Chavez in action. And of course, he dies the next year. Euro becomes president, and the declive. But it's interesting. Mike, in and out.
Let's check for the online people,
Yeah.
so they don't, yeah, there we
Do
go.
I use this? And do I, okay. Does this work?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So what Eduardo was talking about is very interesting, because Venezuela was seen in Latin America as this sort of model democracy. A series of dictatorships in the first half of the century, and then in 1959, the last dictatorship, President Jimenez, is overthrown, and you get the start of Venezuelan democracy from the early 60s on. And you have two main political parties, which is Acción Democrática and COPE, who, you know, roughly mirror Democrats and Republicans. And you have what appears to be a stable democracy with regular elections and a regular transfer of power from one party to the next. Very similar to the US. One party is in the presidency frequently, the other party wins the subsequent term, and they go back and forth. And so there's this appearance of a robust, well-functioning democracy. But sort of the foundations of that democracy were never terribly strong. And especially what happens in Venezuela is that the political parties begin to lose their strength and their cohesiveness. And in a lot of ways, you can look at Venezuela and Venezuela's history, and it's a cautionary tale for the United States and other democracies in a lot of ways. Clearly, very different countries, very different economies, but there are things where that we need to really sit up and pay attention to. And one of these things is the political parties, and you've seen that elsewhere in Latin America as well. But there's this process where the parties begin to lose the confidence of the electorate, and they become seen as incompetent, unable to govern, in the case of Venezuela, extremely corrupt. And so you have the oil boom in the 70s, and this great prosperity and this great sort of lifting of expectations. And then you get the crash that follows, because oil is always in this boom and bust cycle, and the country isn't prepared for this crash. And so then you have this period of stagnation from the 80s into the 90s. And of course, you have the Caracas, which is the riots in 1989. And so you have this process where expectations were lifted, people are deeply disappointed, and they see their political leaders squabbling, filling their pockets, And they start to lose confidence in both the political process and in the parties themselves. The parties are, I mean, when we think about the institutions of democracy, there's the Congress, there's the executive branch, there's the courts, there's the electoral process. There's also the political parties. Those are part of the institutionalization of democracy, the institutional structure of democracies. And when people start to lose confidence in the parties, then where do you go at election time, and where do you sort of make your political home? And so Chavez appears first with the coup in '92, and then when he leaves jail, he ultimately runs for election. And at the beginning, he's completely, nobody gives him a chance. And he runs as an outsider candidate. And the parallel here to Trump is very obvious because, Trump emerges as this sort of outsider candidate, a disruptor candidate. That's what I'm looking for. And nobody gives him a chance. And then, of course, he winds up winning, and Chavez had a very similar trajectory there. And so he wins, and he wins because nobody has faith in the political parties anymore, and they're looking for some kind of, anything. We want this guy who says he's going to tear it all down and start over, which is what Chavez promised to do. And, it finally, with Maduro, everything got torn down. So I get there, and so Chavez becomes president in '99. The price of oil is $8 a barrel, less than $8 a barrel. The country's gone through this long period of economic stagnation, and Chavez is very fortunate. People say that Chavez had charisma. What Chavez really had was oil over $100 a barrel. He had a lot of money, and money is equal to charisma in politics. So he happens to be president when the country's on the upswing, and all this money pours into the country as the price of oil goes up. He's got a lot of money to spend. So, and at the same time, he's sort of tearing things down. Chavez is, people say Chavez is a socialist, Venezuela is a socialist country. I say that's not true. Chavez was not a socialist. Venezuela is not now and has never been a socialist country. What Chavez was a populist. And what Chavez did was what populists do, which is they thrive off of political polarization, this us versus them, the people versus the enemy of the people. And he builds that and he feeds off that energy. Socialism for Chavez was a brand. It was a branding exercise. It was marketing. He could put on a red T-shirt and have all his people put on red T-shirts, and they could say, oh, we're building socialism, 21st century socialism. What is that? It was the term he made up. Nobody can tell you what it is because it wasn't anything. 21st century socialism was like, whiter teeth, fresher breath. It was a slogan that had nothing behind it. And it's true that, there was the thing about Venezuela is that because the government controls the oil industry and the oil industry is the whole game economically in the country, the government, well before Chavez, had always had a very high level of participation in the economy, second only to Cuba in the region, in the hemisphere. So it's always been an economy that had a very strong government presence, stronger, you could say, with Chavez in power. But a lot of the things, one of the other, part of Chavez's genius or political genius was that he was able to convince people that everything he did was new. 21st century socialism, something new, the Bolivarian Revolution. But what Chavez really was, what Chavez doesn't come out of nowhere. Chavez comes out of what was before. So, and a lot of what Chavez does is simply repeating the mistakes of the 60s and 70s. He's very much imbued in this sort of romantic 60s idea of the Cuban Revolution. The Chavez nationalizes steel mills, industries, farms. Well, the region had already gone through a period of nationalizations or the creation of government-run industries in the 60s and 70s. That was the trend at that point. Then in the 80s and 90s, they sold it all off. Chavez comes in, he says, well, he starts buying it all back. So he's repeating things that have been done before. And you could point to that and say it's socialism, but I think we also need to say, what is the function of what Chavez did? was Chavez creates the missions, which are his social programs. And when we look at the missions, we say, well, do they have a social function? In other words, is the purpose of these programs to make people's lives better? Or do they have a political function, which is to continue Chavez in power, to get reelected? And, you know, in any country, you know, a government program has both of those functions. But in the case of populism, the political side is accentuated to an extreme. And so one of the ones I'm most familiar with is when I was in Venezuela in 2012, when Chavez was running for election, his last campaign, there was Misión Vivienda, where the government has this huge campaign to build thousands of housing units. There's a huge housing shortage in the country. You know, we're gonna solve the housing shortage. They built thousands of housing units. They spent millions of dollars, a lot of it borrowed from the Chinese, a lot of it coming from the high price of oil. And so I went to several of these, and I went to one that was well built and seemed like a. Oh, also they would. It was essentially part of the re-election campaign, and so they had these every Thursday. There was a TV show. It was called Jueves de Vivienda, and it was like a reality show. It was like a game show. Chavez would show up at some recently built housing development, and he would give away an apartment, and there would be this big sort of program, and he would have the keys, and then some lucky family would come in, and they would open the door, and Chavez would be there handing over the apartment to them, and the lucky family actually got the best apartment with the premium level of washer and dryer and a big flat screen TV. And every single Thursday, that was what the housing program was. Unfortunately, a lot of these housing complexes were really badly built. The construction was rushed, the design was bad. I've been to 14-story apartment towers in a big complex of 14-story apartment towers in an area called Macarrao, which is on the edge of Caracas. And the buildings are designed so badly that every time it rains, the ground floor apartments all flood, and then the basement floods. And the basement is where the elevator equipment is housed. And so the elevators go out. And so you have people living in 14-story apartments who have to every day walk up and down because the way the buildings were designed and the construction was rushed, that's what they ended up with. And I've been to others where the windows are falling out, everything's leaking, the apartments were handed over before they were finished because they wanted to get everything done before the election. And so when you look at this, it's clear here that the purpose of this social benefits program was really a political benefits program for Chavez's reelection. And so much of what Chavez did was where the primary function was. But at any rate, 2012, Chavez gets reelected. 2013, Chavez dies. And so you have a double crisis that is behind the collapse of Venezuela, which is what we've seen in the last 8 years. And the first crisis is Chavez's death, which is the political crisis. Maduro steps in as the one that was picked by Chavez to follow him. And, he's very uncertain politically, untested. He doesn't have the political talents or experience of Chavez. So there's this political vacuum at the top. And Chavez, for 14 years, had been president in this very sort of, ego-centered, it was all, it's all you're with Chavez or against Chavez. Very much in the way that in this country over the last, several years, you're either with Trump or against Trump. Very much you get this, that's what this polarization leads to. And also in this sort of way of governing in this tumultuous way and very mediatic and on TV and tweeting and being as controversial and sort of feeding the most violent sort of elements among his followers and constantly calling out his opponents as escualidos and the enemies of the people. And so it's very intense, feverish political environment, and all of a sudden he disappears. So you have the political crisis, and then about a year and a half after Chavez dies, the price of oil drops. And so that's the beginning of the economic crisis. And those two things sort of feed together. and turn into this collapse. And the reason that you get the collapse instead of just a couple years of recession is that Maduro makes a lot of really bad decisions with the economy. So I mean, a lot of it's sort of technical, but essentially the country runs out of money because oil's the whole game in town. They had saved nothing during all those years. I mean, one of the interesting things is Bolivia doesn't have oil, but they have natural gas. And and Bolivia sold lots of natural gas to Argentina and Brazil when the price went up in the 2000s. And Bolivia saved a lot of that money. So when the price dropped, they had a big cushion. Venezuela saved nothing. They had, when Chavez came to power, there was essentially a rainy day fund that was legally required. And Chavez got the law changed. And he took all the money out of the rainy day fund. And by the time he died, there was 3 million in it, which is, in those terms, is zero. And so Maduro has no money, but he has all these political needs, and he has to keep everybody happy, and he needs to have social programs, and the army needs, attention. And so he keeps spending money with no money coming in. And in order to do that, of course, he has to print money. And so you get this sort of exaggerated deficit spending, which leads to hyperinflation. And so prices start going up. And then Maduro doubles down on, what's it called? Price controls. And he sends the soldiers into stores to lower the prices. But then there's like tremendous shortages. And so they do this thing where you can only go shopping on certain days of the week based on the last numeral of your ID card. And there's huge stores and all these lines. And they send soldiers to patrol the stores and the lines and check people's cars. Just sort of these, like one thing on top of another. And then, of course, the other element is the exchange rate, where he keeps the exchange rate of the bolivar artificially low, and the black market bolivar shoots up, or shoots down. Actually, the dollar shoots up. And there's this huge imbalance between the black market rate and the official rate, which creates the opportunity for tons of all sorts of corruption, which gets completely out of hand. So you have the totally out of whack economy that just gets worse and worse and worse because Maduro keeps making bad decisions. And you get to hyperinflation. Maduro cracks down on the protests. He engineers his reelection through, by barring Capriles and Lopez and others from running against him, and he changes the election rules. And then you get this outflow of refugees, 6 million people leaving the country, as the crisis just snowballs and gets worse and worse. And that, almost brings us today. And then, of course, you have then Trump comes in, and he has this maximum pressure approach. And he starts piling sanctions on. And there's sort of a false argument in the whole environment around sanctions, where people who are pro-sanctions say Maduro's responsible for the economic crisis in Venezuela, not the sanctions. And it's true that Maduro's bad decisions created the economic crisis. And it's also true that the sanctions deepened the crisis and prolonged it. Essentially, another important thing to understand about Trump and the sanctions is that I like to say that when Trump was president, the White House didn't have a Venezuela foreign policy. The White House had a Florida electoral strategy that used Venezuela. So Trump gets elected, and he immediately starts looking forward to 2020 and the midterms. And he sees that Florida is of supreme importance. It has 29 electoral votes, the third most of all the states. And he sees Venezuela as a key to the vote in Florida, and in particular, the Hispanic voters. You can talk more about this than I can, but there's not all that many Venezuelan American voters, but there's a lot of Cuban Americans, Colombian Americans, Nicaraguan Americans, and they're all keenly focused on what happens in Venezuela, and very anti-Maduro, anti-socialist, and anti-communist, and very receptive to what becomes Trump's message, which is the Democrats are socialists, they're friends with Maduro, Democrats are going to turn the United States into Venezuela. And then when Biden becomes the candidate, it's Biden's the socialist, Biden's Maduro's friend. And in 2020, there's a whole campaign around that through targeted phone calls and also on Spanish language radio here. And the Democrats lose Florida, Trump wins Florida, the Republicans pick up 2 congressional seats. Probably the biggest reason is that the Democrats got out organized, or the Republicans were better organized in the state than the Democrats were. But one factor was the Hispanic vote. So you have this atmosphere where the policy towards Venezuela is intensely politicized. Biden becomes president, and he wants nothing to do with Venezuela policy because he sees it as a no-win kind of thing. He can only get burned. Any sort of change to the sanctions, any sort of move to negotiate or have dialogue with Maduro is going to bring accusations of softening, becoming softer towards Maduro, helping Maduro, and that's just going to hurt the Democrats politically in the state. So he sort of has a hands-off attitude. I mean, he does TPS, which he promised to do during the campaign, but it's not clear to me how much of a political payoff he gets from that. They basically sort of let things go. And then, of course, there's the whole Guaido. I don't know how much we want to get into Guaido, but at any rate, at this point, here we are with Russia invading Ukraine. Suddenly, the whole oil supply chain in the world is disruptive, and they send this mission to Caracas to talk to Maduro. One of the things they talk about is bringing oil to the U.S., which is not likely to happen in any significant way. But that does bring this fierce backlash. Marco Rubio tweets, Valdemi comes out against it. Everybody piles on Maduro. How dare you? And, you wrote an editorial recently saying the sanctions aren't working. Let's not continue with the sanctions. And in my reporting, what I learned is that in the White House, under Trump, there had been a lot of discussion about sanctions. Under McMaster, General McMaster, who was Trump's second national security advisor, they had come up with this whole sort of what they called the escalating roadmap, which was this series of sort of gradually increasing sanctions to try and increase pressure on Maduro. The goal being fair elections, which doesn't happen because he engineers his reelection in 2018. But at the very end of that roadmap, they put the oil embargo against Venezuela. And in discussing it, they said, one person called it the nuclear bomb of sanctions. And they said, well, this is such a disruptive sanction. This would just crush the Venezuelan economy by banning oil sales and essentially, making it very difficult for Venezuela to sell its oil anywhere. And so that's going to have tremendous collateral damage all across the economy, and it's going to hurt average people. And so you should only use, this is what the McMaster folks said, you should only use this oil sanction if you know that Maduro's about to go and he just needs one thing to push him over the edge. You do the oil sanction, Maduro goes away, you lift it, and you've accomplished what you wanted to accomplish. However, if you do it and Maduro doesn't go away, then you're stuck with it. And what you've created is another Cuba where you have a country under this permanent embargo, which you can't lift because it's much easier to create sanctions than to take them away, and which is what we see today. And so they said, be very careful with this one. And they had no intention of using it. Then Bolton comes in as national security advisor, maximum pressure, no understanding really of what's going on in Venezuela. Guaido declares himself president in coordination with the State Department and the White House. The US backs him. All these other countries back him and recognize him as a legitimate president. And Bolton, sitting in the White House, says, let's go for the win. Let's do the oil embargo. And a lot of State Department, Treasury, they oppose it, but he steamrolls them and puts it through, but with no conversation really about, is it likely to work? What happens if it doesn't work? What are the consequences? What are the impact on people? And you could also say today, there was no sort of gaming out the possibilities. What if, world oil supplies are disrupted and we actually need Venezuelan oil? None of that happened. And so it was what somebody at the State Department described as magical thinking. Bolton, who doesn't understand what's going on with Venezuela, thinks, oh, we're, going to get rid of Maduro. Let's do this. And he does it. And 3 years in? Maduro is stronger today, more as secure or more in his position today than he was 3 years ago, and the opposition is much weaker. So you have this policy that didn't work, was never well thought through to begin with, and now any effort to lift it is politically toxic. So
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Bill. Let me try to take you back a little bit because and really encourage you all to read the book. Um, Extraordinarily well written. I was in fact telling my colleague who I have the co-sponsor of this event is the Jack Gordon Institute, and Brian Fonseca, my co-author in the op-ed. Brian, are you still here? He was here a few minutes ago, but he told me he had to go to an event. So, but in any event, one of the things that I found really interesting about your book, and I think journalists do this a lot better than political scientists, right? And those of you who are my students know that I force you to read very poorly written articles. So reading your book is a real joy because it's so well written. And because in fact, I think you capture something. For example, you label socialismo as show socialismo, right? I mean, this idea that it was a marketing ploy, really, that it had nothing to do. But at the same time, you describe this in something that Venezuelans often talk about, but they've been talking about it forever, which is rentism. Is this clientelistic way of spending the oil wealth, and you can go back to beginning in 1914 with the discovery of the first oil well to Marcos Pérez Jiménez and so on. But the other thing that I think is very interesting about what you write is, and something that I tell my students about, that Venezuela only had 8 months of an elected civilian regime in the 20th century before Punto Fijo in 1959. That up until then, the tradition in Venezuela was essentially caudillos. And I make the point that, in fact, maybe the Chavez tradition is much more deeply ingrained in Venezuelan political culture than the 30 years of Punto Fijo. Right? So I think you kind of illustrate this very well in your writing, because Venezuelans have these enormous expectations that a single man is going to solve their problems. And when he dies, of course, things go poorly. So my question to you, and I want you to talk a little bit about two men that you interview in the book, and you write a little bit about them, who I think are emblematic of the tale that you're telling. One is a man named Darwin Briceño, right? And the energy crisis, right? Tell us a little bit about Darwin and why he was so important to you in the book.
Well, thank you very much, Eduardo. And I'm glad you brought up Darwin, because one of the things that I try to do in the book, I mean, we're sitting here talking about politics and economics and geopolitics, but what I really wanted to do in the book is make all this much more concrete. And so as I traveled around Venezuela, I mean, I reported on Venezuela since 2012. And a lot of that goes into the book, going back to the beginning of my time there. But the sort of meat of the book is from 2019, when I spent 3 months crisscrossing the country, and it was in this state of constant chaos with all these, enormous power outages. And I talked to lots of people all around the country. And what I discovered is that people are telling you their stories. You see how their life stories kind of parallel the ups and downs of the country, and you can kind of tell the country's story through these people, through their own personal lives, tragedies, successes, etc. And so I just happened to be there when all these electrical outages were going, the nationwide power outages in Maracaibo. The first one lasted for 5 days, and just sort of disaster. And people could see the country just sort of disintegrating before their eyes. And I mean, it had been going on for a long time, but that seemed to be just like this sort of cataclysmic, apocalyptic end, especially in Maracaibo, where, anyway. Um, uh, so as I started to focus on the um, electrical situation, I went out to Ciudad Guayana, where the big power plants are. And I just happened across this guy, Darwin. And Darwin is I forget the technical term, but he worked in the central control center for the entire country that controlled the electrical flow for the entire country of Venezuela. Here in the US, we have regional control centers because it's a much bigger country, but in Venezuela, the way things are set up, and in other countries, it's typical. You have one office essentially that, technical office that controls this. And he had worked, his whole career had been there. And there used to be, I would say, 5 of these engineers staffing the office 24 hours a day, 3 shifts a day. And, there would be accidents, crises, and they would deal with them. But mostly they just sort of made sure that the flow of energy, primarily from the hydroelectric plants, stayed steady and got to where it needed to go. Well, with the crisis, everybody starts to leave. And, 6 million people left the country, and you lost tons of highly experienced technical people at PDVSA, the oil company, and at Corpoelec, the electric company, and everywhere else. And so eventually you get to 2019, and there's so few people left working in this control center that is one guy working per shift, all alone, controlling everything going on around the country as the whole system is falling apart. And they would work 24-hour shifts and then be relieved by the next guy who would sit there for 24 hours. And so Darwin just happened to be the guy who was on the job when the power went out for the first time all across the country. And he described sitting there and, the power in the building where he is goes out, which is strange because he's on, they call a priority circuit. The power never goes out, but there's a backup generator, comes back on. And then he sees that the screen in front of him, the screens, there's no information coming in from anywhere across the country. And he starts trying to call those other sort of smaller regional centers, and he can't get anybody because the phones aren't working. In a lot of places, what they found out was that there the backup power for the computers worked, but in a lot of these smaller places, they had been disconnected because something went wrong, they weren't working, they hadn't been maintained, the phones didn't work, the computers didn't work, all around the country, these places. So finally, he sort of discovers that power's out everywhere, and he describes, I think power went out at like 4:50 or something like that in the afternoon, and he's furiously trying to work, and then one of his colleagues comes in to sort of help him, and he can take a break finally at like 8 or 9 p.m. And he describes going out onto this little sort of break room or terrace that they have. And it's the first sort of chance he's had to catch his breath. And he looks out at the city, at the capital of Venezuela. It's totally dark. And so he describes this. And I remember sitting there with him as he's telling me this story. And he goes, he's like, I can still hear that sound as he was sort of expressing and repeating what he had lived through. And so anyway, so he tells this very riveting story, and he's a Chavista, and he's still a Chavista, or at least he was when I interviewed him. And I went and found another group of technicians who had been career guys in the electrical utility, all of them Chavistas, all of them very loyal to Chavez and what they considered to be his idea of making Venezuela into a socialist country that, in their minds would be fair to everybody and help the poor, et cetera. And they had these 4 guys had, tremendous amount of, they'd spent their whole careers there running these huge hydroelectric plants. And they had been driven out of the company by the politicized leadership of the company that Maduro puts in. Maduro put a general in charge of the electrical utility because he needed to sort of make friends in the military and buy support there. He put a lot of generals in charge of a lot of things. And this guy, of course, knew nothing about running electrical utility, but he did know about how military organizations work and how to accuse people of sabotage or demand loyalty. And so they push these guys out for petty political reasons. And then the power goes out across the country. They can't get the power back on again. And they have to go back to these guys who were the ones who knew how things worked, beg them to come back and help. And so these four guys come back and help get the power going again. They go home when power is restored. Power goes out again. They come back again, and they keep repeating this. And eventually, several of them were brought back on as consultants. And they remained through this whole process loyal Chavistas in their minds. In other words, not to Maduro necessarily, but to the idea of what they thought Chavez represented. And I just found that fascinating because they had been victims of this system that Chavez created and that Maduro continued and exacerbated. And they had seen this, they worked their lives in the electrical industry, and they saw the whole thing fall apart because of the bad management and the stupidity and the corruption. And yet they remained loyal to what they saw as this ideal.
And again, it's also a problem of not investing in what was at one point, like if you take my notion of a great party system in the late 80s, right, or during Punto Fijo, and just not nurturing it, not building the institutions, and them collapsing.
Right.
In the 80s, people looked up to Venezuela's power grid as something
world class.
Exactly. And so, again, it's not in. Let me ask you about another man that you interview, or perhaps as you illustrated in your book, maybe he yelled at you for 45 minutes. And this is a different kind of Chavista, though. This is the disenchanted Chavista. His name is Ismael Garcia. Would you share with us your interview with Ismael, which I find that emblematic of what Venezuela is?
Well, Ismael Garcia is a politician in Venezuela, sort of an old school politician. He had been, let me back up. When I first get to Venezuela in 2012, I was determined not to just sort of take any received wisdom about what was Venezuela, what was Chavez. I wanted to really go out and discover for myself what was good, what was bad, what was going on in the country. And so, I took on the project of talking to as many people as possible from essentially what were both sides, the Chavistas and the opposition. And on this one particular day, I'd been in the country for a month or a few weeks or something. I went and I met with Ismael Garcia. And Ismael Garcia at that time was an opposition political leader. He had a small party called Podemos. But his history is that he used to be a Chavi. He used to be I guess he would still consider himself on the left. He used to be in a party called MAS that supported Chavez. He supported Chavez. MAS split eventually between pro-Chavez and anti-Chavez. He stayed with the pro-Chavez side. It split again. He stayed. He created his own party that was pro-Chavez. And he finally splits with Chavez and moves over to the opposition. So, I go to meet him, and I was just part of this project of talking to as many people as possible. And, we shake hands, we sit down, and we're sitting this far apart. And I asked a question or two, but he mostly, as a lot of politicians will do, just sort of like starts going. And I'm sitting there thinking, he's talking, it felt like he was shouting at me. He's talking really loud. I'm thinking, did I say something that made this man angry? Did I ask the wrong question? And he's like shouting and going. And then I started thinking, well, maybe, at first I felt bad. And I thought, oh, well, maybe he's hard of hearing. Maybe that's, sometimes people, they're a little deaf, they speak loud. Maybe that's what it was. I couldn't figure it out. And we talked about Chavez and we talked about the election and all this stuff. But the big impression I got was just the volume. And I think that partly what it is that that's what politics is in Venezuela. Partly you stand up in front of a group of people and you talk as loud as you can. And he comes from that school of sort of, politics as sort of shouting, addressing groups. But I also, it wasn't at that moment, but over time, I came to see, I had this image of Venezuela that that I called the shouting country, because I would go out in the street and I would interview people, just sort of ordinary people standing online to buy food or doing one thing or another. And they would all start to get worked up and they would start shouting at me because they were worked up about what they were wanted to talk about. And I think this partly comes from polarization. In other words, people were so set in this you know, what do you call it? A split between two sides. That you know, you were either for or against. You were either a friend or an enemy. So they get all worked up and they start shouting. And so I had this image of Venezuela as two groups of people on opposite sides of the street, just sort of shouting at each other. The street's in terrible shape. The sidewalk's a mess. But they don't stop to fix the sidewalk or to fix the street. They're just more interested in saying what they're thinking without listening to what the other side is thinking. And this experience with Ismael Garcia sort of fit into that. And then just so happened that later in that day, I went and met with Luis Brito Garcia, who's a Chavista intellectual. And it was a similar but opposite sort of experience where I went to see Luis Brito. And the whole time I was with him, he never looked at me. And I go to his house and he sort of always was looking at the ground, and the yard in front of his house is a mess, and his house is sort of oddly disheveled, a potted plant falling over. And I was like, well, wow, does he have like a sight problem? Does he have limited sight or something like that? And I had this idea of a country of people who couldn't see the reality around them on the Chavista side, who wanted to see the country that they, you know, idealize, the ideal vision of the country instead of what was the ruin that was really there. And this other group of people that just wanted to shout without listening. So it was that was a formative early experience.
Kind of reminds me a little bit about what we're going through.
Well, that's why I say Venezuela is a cautionary tale for the U.S.
Right.
And you see, in Venezuela, you see the consequences of polarization.
Right.
And that polarization within this context of populism, because what a populist figure does and needs to do is mine that polarization in order to, you know, I represent the people. The people are with me. Anybody who's not with me is not the people, they're the enemy.
Right.
So.
Well, I want to give those of you who are here an opportunity to ask Willie any questions. I don't know if you have, Carlos, identify yourself for us.
Well, I can repeat the question.
Yeah, I can repeat it.
All right.
Yeah. How do you take Maduro's recent take of privatization and liberalization of the economy compared to Chavez expropriation and basically take over much of the economy?
That's a great question. And I think that's, when I say Venezuela isn't a socialist country, that's the best example, because what Maduro has done in Venezuela over the last year, maybe year and a half, is he's enacted an extreme form of what people call a neoliberal austerity package, which countries tend to put in place, usually with the help of the IMF, after some, you know, economic crisis similar to what Venezuela's been through, hyperinflation, et cetera, or high inflation, et cetera. But in the case of Venezuela, it's been done without any public acknowledgement of what they're doing, any public dialogue or debate. But it is sort of most extreme neoliberal Milton Friedman type thing that Maduro and people of his ilk have spent their entire lives denouncing. And now he has created what, you know, could easily be the most extreme form of this ever seen in the region, because it involves extreme budget cuts to social services, you know, complete opening the door to imports, lack of regulation, and privatization. The privatization is mostly silent, but they've promised all sorts of things to foreign companies who would be willing to come in and work in the oil fields, including giving up a lot of the control over oil field projects that was sort of the banner of Chavismo. Other places too, for instance, Maracaibo, we have Maracucha here. strangely enough, today has great internet service. And it had, it barely had any internet a couple of years ago. And the reason is that apparently there is a fiber optic network in place, and the government has brought in private companies and allowed them to take that and run it. And it costs a lot of money, but if you're willing to pay the money, you can get excellent internet service. And that's through an unannounced privatization of that service. And, there's clearly, and there's other examples as well. So, so Maduro, while he declares himself a socialist still, is doing the opposite of what, in theory, a socialist would do. He also calls himself an anti-imperialist. Maduro has been, the loudest cheerleader in the region for Putin ahead of the invasion of Ukraine. And so you have the anti-imperialist leader, supporting a bigger country, invading a smaller country. So there's no, I mean, the surface is not the reality there.
Yeah, yeah. First, thank you so much for coming. Regarding foreign investment, I know China really didn't invest in Venezuela before Chavez. And I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, the latest oil tanker, they had to reject the oil because it was such bad quality. How did you see that relationship between, the foreign investment of Venezuela with China and that relationship and kind of where it is today?
Well, I don't think it was so much a Chavez thing that the Chinese came in to invest, because the Chinese during that period were coming into the entire region and investing in many countries in a big way. And I think they may be the biggest foreign investor in South America at this point. So that was happening anyway. Chavez encouraged it. And then Chavez, he started this program with the Chinese where he borrowed billions of dollars. I forget the numbers now, but he essentially created a slush fund under his control alone, where he brought in, I would say, tens of billions of dollars over several years. And, the Chinese were very smart about it. Essentially, they were loaning billions to Venezuela, mostly on the condition that Venezuela spend the money in China. And so Venezuela, bought satellites from China. They brought in, washers and dryers and cars and buses and motorcycles to give away. It was billions in loans to feed the Chinese economy. And then the arrangement was always that it would be paid back with oil shipments. So it was essentially the futures deal where you were borrowing today for, tomorrow's, to be paid in tomorrow's oil. Now, as far as with the U.S. sanctions, what's happened is that most of the Venezuelan oil goes through very circuitous means and winds up not with the main Chinese state-controlled, the big oil companies in China, but with these small refineries that are called teapot refineries. So I hadn't heard about a shipment being rejected, but the problem now that Maduro's going to have is that his oil has been going to China at a discount, and Russia's been his banker. Now, with Russia's oil banned, all that Russian oil is going to be going to these same refineries, and so they're going to be taking away Maduro's market. And Maduro's banker is now locked up behind sanctions too. So that's another element to this whole dialogue between the U.S. and Venezuela, because Maduro very soon may be desperate to find a place to send his oil. So.
Hello, thank you very much for being here. And I'm looking forward to reading your book. Seems very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I teach Latin American politics and international relations of Latin America, and we talk about Venezuela. And since you're here in Miami, and we have so many members of the opposition to Maduro in Miami, my question to you is, you mentioned that the opposition is very weak now. So what options do they have now?
Well, I think that there's there's fascinating things happening in Venezuela at the moment, both politically and economically, and there's a lot of things that are changing, even though you don't hear much about it. And it's not getting written about very much. I mean, you have all these economic changes that Carlos here pointed to, which is a real big change and a real discipline in the way of organizing or of managing the economy on the government's part, and also the beginning of economic growth again, finally. On the political side, you had these elections in November where the result was fascinating because the opposition, I mean, despite the fact that a lot of people, you know, that important people were calling for an election boycott, including Guaido, who didn't go out and vote and didn't campaign for anybody. You did have opposition participation in the election, despite the fact that there were no guarantees that there were, you know, there was still the same lopsidedness as we've had previously. What I mean is there are no improvements in the electoral climate. The opposition wins 123 alcaldías, mayorships, whereas before it had less than 30. There's 23 states. Chavismo won 19 of them. The opposition won 4, including ultimately Barinas, where Chavez was from. But when you look at the states that Chavismo won, in 15 of the 19 states, the Chavista candidate won with less than 50% of the vote. And so what was going on is that the opposition was running multiple candidates because they couldn't agree together on a single candidate, and they were splitting the vote. So you had these states that actually had a majority of vote for somebody other than a Chavista candidate. And so what happened with the alcaldías and what happened in the governorships, it signals an extreme weakness on the part of the government electorally. And on the opposition side, there's, you know, it's positive that they won all these alcaldías and they got all these votes, but the warning there is that this tendency of theirs to fight with each other, which isn't a tendency, it's a, you know, it's the fundamental characteristic of the opposition, that is always the great obstacle for them. Now, what's happened since then is also very interesting because you have this atomization of the opposition. You have the main opposition parties, they're just breaking apart. And in some cases, they're breaking apart with the encouragement or the meddling of the government. But even in those cases, what you have is the internal tensions and conflicts of these parties are coming out. And in some cases, the government is taking advantage of that. But these parties are essentially, and I'm talking about Voluntad Popular, Primero Justicia, et cetera, they tend to be organized around a single person and that person's ambitions to ultimately become president. And there isn't a lot of internal democracy in these parties. And a lot of the people inside these parties are now pushing back against that. But you had the split in Acción Democrática. You've had dozens and dozens of people leaving Voluntad Popular. You had Primero Justicia was obliterated in Miranda and Caracas, where it used to have its strength. I heard a joke the other day where in Libertador, Primero Justicia came in 3rd behind the Chavista and another opposition candidate. Also in Sucre, the same thing happened, and they were basically wiped out in Miranda State. And so they came in 3rd in Sucre and in Libertador. So Primero Justicia means justice first, and now people are calling them justice 3rd because they keep coming in 3rd in their own stronghold. But and then also Henry Falcon's party split in 2. And so you have, so this is, I was talking to Hugo Torrealba the other day, who's an opposition activist, and he said, this is the consequence of defeat. In other words, you know, the whole Guaido thing fizzled. Even though they did well in this last election, they've had this long series of defeats and all these tensions building up inside these parties, especially through the Guaido period, where people were trying to toe the line with Guaido, but there was a lot of resistance and a lot of people didn't like what was going on there. And so now it's all coming out in the open, and these parties are just blowing up, essentially. And they're partly blowing up because there's been no renewal in these parties. I mean, Henry Ramos has been the head of Acción Democrática, I don't even remember for how long. And the guy who split from him has been by Henry Ramos's side for that long. And, you know, Leopoldo Lopez has run his party, and Capriles and Julio Borges have been ahead of that, but there's no renewal in these parties. There's no room for young people to come up and or have new leadership. And now you have new parties like Lapis and there's the other party that did well in Caracas. I'm forgetting the name right now, but you've had these. Yeah, exactly. And so there's this churn within the opposition, and something has to come out of that. And ultimately, everything points to 2024 with the presidential election, and the hope is that you'll have a single opposition candidate. And it's really hard to tell at this point where that's going to come from. But I think the opposition has to let this process happen. And there's, I think, that inside Venezuela, there's a recognition that the Guaido thing is over. I mean, almost nobody talks about him outside of his circle. Oh, very few people refer to him as President Guaido anymore. Although I noticed that on his material, he's taken off the interim and he just called himself President Guaido at this point. So it's really up to them to figure out how to, allow new voices, new people, new energy, and channel them.
Well, Willie, thank you so much. I know you have to run, and I'm sure the rest of you also probably have to go to class as well. So thank you again, Lindsay, who put this all together. Thank you so much. My thanks also to President Luis Guillermo Solis, who couldn't be here, as you know, and he would have made a very, very much better interviewer, I think, today. But he had another commitment. And of course, on behalf of the Jack D. Gordon Institute as well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all. And there are some copies of the book in the back if any of you are interested, and I'm sure that Willie will sign your books.
Well, thank you very much, Eduardo. I'm very gratified to be here and for your words about the book. And thank you for everybody who came, and happy to stick around and talk for a while, and people have questions. So thank you.